Next, I'd like to introduce Jaime Pinkham, our second keynote speaker. And I had the pleasure of meeting Jaime quite a few years ago, not long after he joined the board of the Wilderness Society where I work. That was, what did you say, 96, something like that? And it's been a pleasure to get to know him, to realize the breadth and wealth of knowledge that he has, both in natural resources and conservation, but also in terms of collaboration and working with people and tribal governance. It's really pretty amazing to look across his career. And as Jaime describes, his formal education comes from his parents and his grandparents. Learning about wilderness, natural resources through elk hunting with his father and grandfather. Learning how to catch fish for dinner. Picking huckleberries with his grandmother. Camping, hiking in the land around where he lives, not on trails or in campgrounds, but just in the natural landscape that he considered part of his home and his community. In fact, he said he didn't think he'd ever experienced wilderness until he went to the city of Seattle. And also, his work with collaboration and people and communities and governance stems from some of his earlier experiences as well. Apparently his mother and his grandmother were wonderful listeners, and people came to them for guidance. And so he was able to learn from those interactions over the years. And of course, there was some formal education along in there in forestry and university. And I encourage you all to go to the longer and more formal bio that we have posted on the conference website to learn more details about that. It does include work and descriptions of his time with the Nez Perce tribe, working for the tribe, and private foundation work, and his current work at the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. Oh, and I meant to say, I apologize right up front, that Jaime is a member of the Nez Perce tribe. He was born on the Nez Perce tribe in Idaho and grew up largely on the Yakima tribe lands in Washington state. And now I will turn it over to you, Jaime, to share a little bit more about your values of the land and why we're all here doing this great work.
Thank you, Janice, for the friendship and for the kind introductions, and thanks to all of you for allowing me to spend some time with you. And you know, Janice and I had breakfast this morning, and I said, don't use that bio stuff. That talks about this treadmill, this professional treadmill, because there's more to my life than that. And she's right. You know, I didn't think there was wilderness. You know, hunting from chasing elk with behind my grandfather and father. That's just what we did. You know, but she's right. The first time I went to Seattle and saw the traffic, now that was wild. And you know, so I said, let's stay away from that bio thing. You know, I was recruited to move home to be the Nez Perce Tribe's natural resource manager quite a while ago, and later I wanted even more, so I took the leap of faith into tribal politics, and I was elected to 2 terms. And I loved the job because I was having the time of my life on tribal council. I was running this Nez Perce marathon, and we were, you know, I was racking up these frequent flyer miles, and we were launching casinos and fighting for treaty rights and native sovereignty, and we were financing and investing, buying and selling, building and expanding, and yes, we were gambling. I was testifying and negotiating, celebrating and commiserating, and when necessary, we were litigating. But then I lost my balance. You know, the membership dues to play blind ambition on this professional treadmill, it comes at a high personal cost. And my greatest losses weren't professional or political, they were personal. And those are the ones that sting the most. And in this marathon, a divorce crossed the finish line before I could, and tired, I felt I needed a break. And I accepted a job in Portland, Oregon, working for the Trust for Public Land for a while. And you know, there was heartache in the day that I left Nez Perce to take the job in Portland, but I learned that Heartache isn't always bitter, because lingering with it is this longing for place, a love for family. So heartache has always been my reminder to never again lose sight of home and to make a commitment that wherever life will take me, I will finish the job. But then later, I needed even a bigger time out, and so I went on a sabbatical for 9 months. Just to get off the treadmill. And I find myself volunteering for different tribal conservation and educational efforts. And I found out that working for free is a hard secret to keep. And so unemployment actually kept me really busy. But I love the temple because I could pick to work on the causes and with the people to protect the places that I love the most. But seriously, I did favor play over work. I'd get up in the morning and I'd toss on my Oregon State University sweatshirt, my silk boxers and wool socks. Back then I could make it look good. I can't do that anymore. And I'd brew a pot of coffee and I'd get online and I'd get some work done. But at midday, I'd take off on my bike and I'd go for a bike ride or beat the crowd at a matinee on a Wednesday. You ever do that? I tell you, that was the best medicine I'd ever taken. And a dear friend of mine knew I was working for free, so she said, why don't you help me out in this project in the Yukon? And so while I was in Fairbanks helping out on his project, I had stumbled onto this beautiful site. Now I want you to picture this. Wintertime, Alaska style. Stunningly gorgeous. In this crowd of about 200 US and Canadian Yukon Native leaders was this stunning blonde with a yellow turtleneck. And I couldn't help but to ask her, what's your story? And I found out in our conversation, and she was an intern for an organization I still do a lot of work with today called the Yukon River Intertribal Watershed Council, and she was interning with them, and I had to ask her, what is your story? And I found out, in our conversations that we had traveled similar paths. She returned to her homeland the same year I returned to mine. She advocated for the principles of self-determination so that her homeland could map its own destiny. She worked on reacquiring their languages, which they had almost lost through years of occupation and oppression. And she labored alongside her father on environmental restoration and to get lands back into the original owner's hands. And I enjoyed listening to her, and I admit I enjoyed listening to her just as much as I enjoyed looking at her. And while familiar and similar stories, her story took considerably more courage than mine did. She had gunfire in her streets. Her homeland is not a native nation here in the US. Her homeland is Latvia. And she moved there in the 1990s to work on the independence movement to break Latvia free of Soviet rule. In Latvian, the word asensabals means a blood calling, like the calling of one's ancestors. And she heard it and she responded and moved home against her parents' wishes to be a part of a peaceful demonstration for independence, which didn't turn out to be peaceful, as time would tell. And I like telling this story about Tia Karklis because it shows that, we all have a connection to place. This connection to place isn't just this romantic story always found in native cultures, but you find it all over. You even find it in this room, which is really a rally point for people who have a strong connection to place. So, get this right. So Tia and my connection grew even quickly, and I used this cache of frequent flyer miles to keep this love connection from Fairbanks to Portland going at least monthly. And it's interesting, even on our second date when she flew down, our second date was the birth of my first granddaughter. And then eventually her internship ended and she moved back to Latvia. About the same time my sabbatical was ending, but I converted more frequent flyer miles and I flew over to spend time with her. And this is her father's village of Zavarde. And we're standing next to a bombed out church. During World War II, when her parents were children, and they fled Latvia as the German and Russian armies were pushing against each other in her homeland, this is the village her father fled. And the Soviets eventually occupied the land. They turned her father's homeland, the village of Zavarde, into a bombing range, confiscated all the land. And over time, the church was bombed out. And when I visited her in Zavardi, and I said, or in Latvia, I said, I want to go to your father's homeland. And here we are standing at the church. And what I found very striking about this is even through the passage of time and wind and war, people have, and you can see it off to the left, a little cross. People have started putting these pews in there and an altar. They're gathering at this church. And for me, I said, this church never stands in ruins. It stands in triumph. The connection over time and wind and war, as I said, and its enduring love for a place. This is actually the place where I proposed, and she said yes. So so here's what happens when you get off that professional treadmill. Things like this happen to your life, and I'm the fortunate husband of a woman with a courageous yet soothing and spirited soul. You heard this a little bit earlier in what some of Don's remarks too, and if you've ever been to one Indian reservation, you've only been to one Indian reservation. As Don and others were explaining to you, the complexity of Indian country. Tribes are the oldest, yet we're the most misunderstood governments in this country. So let me offer this disclaimer as I get into my remarks. And I ask you to remember that not all tribes are the same. And the words and what I'm going to share with you, the perspectives, should not be taken to represent all of Indian country. Please see them through my lens as I was introduced of, what I determined to be wild and how I was raised by my grandmother and my mother. Tribes are just as diverse as you'll find in countries on a European continent in terms of languages and forms of governance and religions and cultures. And a multitude of factors have influenced tribes here in the United States. Our histories, court cases, acts of Congress and others, and even our relationship with the natural world has helped shape individual unique identities that distinguish tribes. If you think about here in the United States, there are over 562 federally recognized Indian tribes spread across the many states, and 229 of them are found in the state of Alaska, which has a very unique relationship. So think about what I'm going to say, and let's make sure we don't look at tribes simply as these romantic notions as we sit around the campfire singing scout songs, nor thinking about us in the terms of this lens of casinos. So let's get started here. In the middle of the Columbia River here, this is Miller Island. And this is looking out towards the west. You see Mount Hood in the background, and over the mountains is Portland, Oregon. So the Deschutes River comes in, and Miller Island sits right there in the middle of the Columbia. Well, over a dozen years ago, I was actually hiking on this island with a guy by the name of Johnson McNinik from the Yakima Nation. And together we were leading this TPL fundraising excursion for people who have deep pockets, yet a combined love for the natural landscape and for Native people. And at one point during this hike, Johnson pulls me off to the side and he says, I want you to turn around. And so I turned around looking a totally opposite direction. And he says, what do you see? And he says, you're standing at a looking back place. And he asks, what do you see? Well, knowing Johnson, he wasn't asking me to describe the view, because if you could look closely here, you'll see a bridge crossing the river, the little community of Biggs. You'll see some wind turbines, an interstate, and a highway, and roads and houses scattered. That's visually what you could see. But knowing Johnson, his question was different than that. His question was about a story. Actually, a story of people and place, a history. And it was my history, braided with an ageless history, that led me to that very moment at that very time standing at the looking back place. And if you took Johnson's question and even polished it even more, what he was asking me is, do you know who you are? A pretty important question. Well, that experience with Johnson gets more profound, more significant with each passing year, and I've stretched past 60 years now, and I find myself at more and more looking back places, including podiums just like this one. And so let's begin by looking back, way back to the beginning, at the time of the Great Change. And this is just outside Lewiston, Idaho. Right when you cross from the Washington state border into Idaho is Lewiston, Idaho. This is the Clearwater River. My parents just live upriver about 5 miles. But this is the place where the great change takes place. Just south of that, I had to crop it down at the bottom because just south of the, or below this picture would be the north side of the river, is the tribal casino. That has nothing to do with the great change. Let's be clear about that. But these are the slopes where the great change occurred. Because according to my grandfather, there was a time when the animals could talk, and the Creator called them together to tell them that a great change was coming. And from this great change, a new species would emerge naked, hungry, weak, in need of wisdom to survive in this world. And according to my grandfather, the Creator told the animals that not all of them will survive when the great change occurred. So according to my grandfather, one by one, the species of animals appeared before the Creator to qualify themselves. Salmon was the very first to appear. And salmon told the Creator, from my flesh there will be food, and from my skin there will be glues to help them in fashioning bows and spears. And Creator agreed. Even wolf came forward and told the Creator, I will teach them of the natural constitution so that they will respect the rules of society and learn how to function as a clan. And with those words, wolf qualified. And other species came forward to offer antlers for tools, meat for food, and hides for clothing and shelter. And others came forward to provide spiritual guidance. Well, according to my grandfather, one by one, each of the creatures stood before them, but not all qualified. And according to my grandfather, there was a time when the animals of the land and sky and waters came forward to take an oath. And as different as they all were, they all committed to a common purpose and committed to the call. So the great change occurs. And here comes the human beings, the Nimipu, the Nez Perce. And as promised, the creatures cared for these new creatures, the human beings, to the best of their ability. However, the animals would no longer talk. And the Creator put the power of voice into the human beings. According to my grandfather, that was their time, and today it is our time. It is our time to make the commitments, to act and to speak on behalf of the natural world. It is our time to become qualified. And to me, this story represents the very first treaty, the treaty between the Creator and the creatures. And when the real people, the Nimipu, came into this world, when we arrived, we accepted the obligation with our voice to speak and act on behalf of the natural world, to protect that very first treaty. This story has been told and continually retold for over 13,000 years, which is a testament to its authenticity. And each of our subsequent treaties that the Nez Perce negotiated with the United States acknowledges this very first treaty. For example, 1855, Walla Walla, which is now the state of Washington, the Nez Perce gathered with the United States to negotiate a treaty. And at this negotiation, we secured language that is reflective of the original treaty. And if you just read this language, it talks about the right of taking fish through the reservation and at all usual and accustomed places, the right of taking game and hunting and gathering roots and berries. That first treaty is acknowledged in this formal treaty with the United States. The language is consistent. I've often heard some people say that the Native American, the American Indian, was the first natural resource manager. I think there's always been some truth to that statement, but I've never totally agreed with it. If you think about it, well, first, archaeologists use carbon isotope to measure our existence here for 13,000 years, but we say that's time immemorial, within a few years, I guess. But let's humor the archaeologists and say, yeah, okay, we've been around for over 13,000 years and counting. And we ask ourselves, really, who managed who? We maintained that relationship with the environment, acknowledged that our livelihood depended upon the bounties provided by the sky, the rivers, the prairies, and the forests. Lands offered up foods to nourish us, medicines to heal. It provided materials and places that were essential to our education, our spiritual connectivity, and recreation. We responded to the natural cycles turning upon the land and the waters. We did not make the salmon run. We didn't make the roots and berries grow. When the salmon returned to the waters of their birth, we followed. When the roots and berries reached back to the high country, so did we. In other words, nature managed us. We realized that a healthy, functioning environment was intimately tied to a healthy, functioning tribal community. But then, and you heard some of this in the earlier panel, the challenges came across Indian tribes time and time again. Just take it, all these federal policies. Somebody was saying, take an Indian law class. Here's Indian Law 101 in 10 seconds. All these policies. First, it was coexistence. The tribes had the military power. We had the access to abundant resources, so let's have a peaceful coexistence with the tribe. Well, that didn't work, so the federal policy evolved. Let's remove them and relocate them. Let's isolate them on Indian reservations and gain access to the natural resources. Well, after that, let's try assimilation. Let's get them to be less Indian. How about they fade into the melting pot and mix with the rest of society? Well, that didn't work, so let's try reorganization. Let's disband their traditional forms of government and try to give them foreign ways of governing themselves. And the list goes on and on and on. The disasters, one of the most botched federal policies, termination. Let's just liquidate their identity and hope they fade away. But it didn't stop there. So these were federal policies, but other policies to develop the West began to affect us as well. You want to build bigger cities and bigger economies to support them. So there was logging and mining and agriculture and industrialization and urbanization and the power that's needed to generate it all. I like this picture. This is the John Day Dam in the Columbia River, and there's, even though it's not a wild-flowing river anymore, you see our traditional scaffolds fishing in a traditional way with this industrialization in the background. And it's about the significance of a way of life and clinging to that way of life regardless of the obstacles that is thrown in our way, whether it's concrete or political. So, it seemed like these newcomers saw the land as the landscape. They saw it as empty, with plenty of room for expansion, and at the same time, they saw it as full with an abundance of resources. But over time, they were right. It was empty and it was full. But it became empty as we started to see these species wither towards extinction, and it was starting to become fuller and fuller as we saw these toxins beginning to cling to our air and our waters. And like the Nez Perce, we went into a winter time. It was a long winter time. Well, let me tell you about one of my environmental heroes. We all have our environmental heroes. One of my early ones is one of our leaders called Tehulhulzut. And he said this, Kiwatis hemus, he was inam shalak kala watis pim wets kiskonix, impaina, inam pika he was Kiwatis. Now, he spoke these words in 1877 at the debates to force the Nez Perce onto a reservation. And translated, he proclaimed this, "The earth is part of my body. I belong to the land out of which I came. The earth is my mother." And he was not simply expressing an opinion, rather he was testifying about a way of life, saying that the land and the people were inseparable. Regardless, General Howard, who is shown in this drawing here, did not approve of his language and actually had him locked in a stockade for speaking such nonsense. General Howard's lack of tolerance further fanned the embers of war that erupted just weeks later in what General William Tecumseh Sherman would announce as the most extraordinary of Indian wars, 1877. Well, let's fast forward, and here's another one of my heroes, and this has a connection to 1877. This is my sister. I call her my sister because we're very close. Her name is Mary Wood, and she teaches natural resource law and Indian law at the University of Oregon, and she's been working on this concept about the public trust doctrine. And some of you may have heard about how these students are holding the federal government accountable for the atmospheric trust. This is based on a lot on Mary's work on the public trust doctrine. But let's back up and let me share with you the connection Mary has to 1877. So we warred against the United States, and at the final battle, not far from Don's homeland at Blackfeet, just 30 miles short of the Canadian border where we were hoping to find freedom, it was one of our few surviving chiefs who handed over his rifle to the military. And his name was Chief Joseph. And he spoke these words which have been recorded for history about being tired, and he's tired of fighting, and he concludes his remarks by handing over his rifles by saying, "Hear me, my chiefs. I am tired, my heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I shall fight no more forever." Well, General Howard was present at that moment, and so was his aide, and his aide was this young lieutenant who was jotting down Joseph's words as they were being translated by an interpreter. And that lieutenant was Mary's great-grandfather, Charles Erskine Scott Wood. And it's just interesting to think about how her great-grandfather fought against my grandfather, but over time, how time would heal relationships and strengthen bonds that she and I feel as family. So Mary she lectures about this public trust doctrine, and she describes it as one of the oldest and the most fundamental doctrines that connects people to the natural world. And she says, as the world has understood since time immemorial, a government that fails to protect its natural resources sentences its people to misery. Now, I'm not a legal scholar like Mary, and if you're a law student or an attorney in the audience here, don't rely on my interpretation of the public trust doctrine. But hear me out as I look through this doctrine with native eyes. You know, today Indian tribes talk about this trust responsibility we have with the United States, and where the tribes will tell the U.S., you are duty-bound to protect our rights and serve our interests. And we spend considerable time holding the federal government accountable to this trust and responsible in its delivery. But if that is all tribes do, then we're going to fall short. Because Mary also points out that as first governments in this country, tribes were the first trustee on behalf of both people and the land. In other words, there was a time when we were the sole trustee, and while it might appear to be easier if we just held the federal government accountable, for the protection of our communities in our natural world, we need to ask ourselves, what of our trust responsibility as the first trustee in government on this land? What is our responsibility? What is our native public trust doctrine? And what is our responsibility to the natural world? And I'm not saying this to say that, we got to stop holding the federal government responsible. We cannot release them of any of that responsibility. But what I'm saying is that we have this timeless responsibility tied to that very first treaty that gives us the first right of refusal on a public trust doctrine. And I feel that rebuilding our native nations really is about us using our self-determination and our sovereignty to take on these complicated, controversial tasks. Think about this. Nowhere has any community in this country suffered so much in terms of progress and development than Native communities, because land and water was twisted from our grips. But today, think about this, and you heard some of the stories earlier. In this turnabout, no segment of this society, no community has done more to restore and protect the environment than those same Native communities. It's been quite a turnabout. We have the various pillars in our communities, that support the welfare of our nations, and among them are the pillars of family and clan, the pillar of culture and language, pillars of religion and homeland, that connection to place. And there are various pillars equal in importance, and collectively they contribute to healthy and wealthy Native nations. And I don't mean health just in physical terms or wealth in financial terms, but another important pillar is the pillar of governance. And that pillar contains the institutions and the rules to maintain a civil society. It allocates roles and responsibilities, including how they are exercised. It administers decision-making processes and resolves disputes. And it also sets priorities on how resources are allocated and services are delivered. And so tribes began to use our sovereignty and self-determination and exercising that first right of refusal on the public trust doctrine to rebuild our communities. We started by holding public officials accountable. We were going to the court. You know, when they tried to fence us off the river, we went to the Supreme Court and we were assured access. Even the Supreme Court justice ruled on our behalf, saying that the tribe's right to fishing was not much less necessary to the existence of the Indians than the atmosphere they breathed. God, he must have got that from the Creator. And when they tried to enforce state laws over our treaty fishing, the court ruled that a treaty takes precedence over state sovereignty. And when they tried to dominate the allocation and the harvest, we took them to court and said we had an equitable right or an equitable share to the fish that is out there. And so we kept winning in the courtroom. But I was mentioning this to some people last night, you know, half the challenge is winning. The other half is to protect a win once you get it. So tribes then started engaging in these political processes in state capitals and in Washington, D.C. And a couple of good examples are the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, which recognizes tribal authority and sovereignty in providing for clean air and water on reservations. In the Pacific Northwest, where I'm from, in the Columbia Basin, it even went further with the passage of the Northwest Power Act that recognized tribes as legitimate co-managers to mitigate for the impacts to fish and wildlife, which were harmed during the construction and the operation of the federal dams. You know, but it takes more than just winning in court. And at Nez Perce, we found ourselves getting involved in a bunch of things. You know, Charles Wilkinson in his book, Blood Struggles, talks about how tribes started to use their self-determination to build these modern institutions of governance. Governance that meets tribal values, not the federal values. And you know, at Nez Perce, we started building, you know, a constitution and bylaws. We have a court system. Transparency, our tribal codes and laws are on our website, so anybody who wants to do business on a reservation knows it's there. We started developing these competent programs, like our fisheries programs, running state-of-the-art hatchery. Our hatcheries uses technology and ideals that is so old it's like new. Our hatcheries really are a mimic of nature. They're not these resorts with these ponds, you know, that they know when they're going to get fed. We were even trying to figure out how do we put predators to chase the little smolts around as they're growing up. You know, trying to condition them to run the marathon of their lives. And we publish, do a lot of scientific research. So we took our legal capacity and our political capacity and we started putting it together with this technical capacity. Because whoever practices the science, whoever manages and collects the data, those are the people who do the decision-making on resource allocation. And we needed to be able to stand toe-to-toe with everybody else in our capability to do that. And now I think if you look at tribes today, they have this scientific, this technological and business wisdom that just can stand toe-to-toe with state and federal agencies. Our tribe, plus other tribes, went a little bit further and formed my organization. All right, so this is where I stop, and I take a plug because my bosses have given me the freedom to be here, so let me do my obligatory plug to my employer and to talk about the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. It represents 4 treaty tribes in the Columbia River Basin: Nez Perce, where I'm from, Yakima, Warm Springs, and Umatilla. And if you look at the brown shade is the Columbia River Basin in both Canada and the U.S. If you look at it in just the U.S. alone, a third of the basin is covered by our treaty territory. And that means we have a far-reaching effect on the federal, state, private lands within that area to protect our treaty reserved rights, access to fish, clean water, access to wildlife too. And we do it at our commission in a variety of ways through management and science. We're delegated the sovereignty of the 4 tribes to run public safety on the river. We have a genetics lab in South Idaho. How many tribes do you know have a fisheries genetics lab? There are not very many of them. But we run a genetics lab to help work on that conflict between hatchery stocks and wild stocks to make sure we try to keep wild stocks genetically pure. We managed 31 properties up and down the Columbia River. Our villages were flooded, and the federal government has been rebuilding places so our tribal members can have access, and hopefully villages rebuilt, homes rebuilt on the river. And it's more than just the iconic salmon and steelhead. We do Pacific lamprey. I was in the Great Lakes area last week, and they hate lamprey. Their nuisance is our delicacy out here in the Pacific Northwest, and we've been doing a lot of work on reintroducing lamprey and protecting sturgeon. Well, let's get back. The Endangered Species Act was signed in 1973. About that same time, the federal government finally got it right on a good Indian policy, and it was called the policy of self-determination. No more termination, no more reorganization, no more relocation. And it was about how do we put the ability to call the shots back in the tribe's hands. So within a year, almost a year of signing the Endangered Species Act, President Nixon signs the Self-Determination Act. And self-determination now becomes the law of the land, which really allows the tribes to begin to set their own priorities and contract programs administered on their behalf through the Interior Department or through the Indian Health Service. Well, it's interesting that these two acts come about a year apart, because I want to use an example of where we put them both to use. In 1974, the gray wolves in the lower 48 states were listed under the Endangered Species Act. And the Fish and Wildlife Service was charged with preparing a plan for the reintroduction in the northern Rocky Mountain region. After about 130 meetings and about 170,000 public comments, a final EIS was completed in 1994. And the region was split into 3 recovery areas: Yellowstone National Park, Western Montana, and Central Idaho. The majority of it covers the homeland of the Nez Perce. And so the wolves would be reintroduced as these experimental, non-essential experimental populations, which would give management flexibility. And they set a goal of 10 breeding pairs over 3 consecutive years. Well, it was the Clinton administration, and you could imagine in states like Washington or Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana, it was met with a great deal of controversy because people saw this as an overreach by this out-of-control liberal national government trying to trample on states' rights. And so after the final rule was published, certainly several groups filed suit in federal court to stop reintroduction, but the federal judge overruled the motion and reintroduction was back on track. But think about this. Traditionally, the federal government, the Fish and Wildlife Service, when they go out and they want to partner with an entity on Endangered Species Act, on species recovery, they traditionally partner with the state agencies under Section 6 of ESA. So actually, the Fish and Wildlife Service original plan did call for a partnership with the state of Idaho. But it was so controversial in Idaho that the state legislature said, state Fish and Game, if you want to do this, you need to prepare a reintroduction proposal and bring it to us for our consent. Idaho Fish and Game went off, developed a plan, brought it back to the legislature, and it's no surprise. It was defeated, leaving the state of Idaho to believe that this damn nonsense of reintroducing wolves will just fade away. But all along, here's the Nez Perce tribe, standing there, saying, what about us? We want a role in this. Now with the state out of the way, the Fish and Wildlife Service had nowhere to turn but to the Nez Perce tribe to do the reintroduction effort. And we tried to use the capacity that we had been developing through the Self-Determination Act. We had created a fisheries program, we had a wildlife program, a natural resource program. We were building the capacity to take this job over, and that's exactly what we did. And it was historic. It was the first time in this country that an Indian tribe took the lead statewide in a recovery of an endangered species. And we're not just talking about any old species. We're kind of talking about a top-of-the-line predator, aren't we? And so it was interesting that the Fish and Wildlife Service manager who was overseeing this, he was quoted in a paper by saying, this issue was too hot to handle. But the tribe put together a good plan, and so he contracted with them. And when what had just happened was the Nez Perce tribe had outflanked Idaho's sovereignty by getting this plan. And when the feds announced that they had a partner and the tribe would now take over the recovery effort in the state of Idaho, boy, Idaho was pissed. And you should have heard the furious voices, from political leaders and interest groups like livestock, outfitters and guides, and the gentle anti-federal government activists. With state opposition, we set out to manage a most controversial task in a most skeptical political landscape. But I always felt that the mirror of the wolf and the mirror of the Nez Perce, both of them were a mirror of one another. And if you think back to when the trailblazers had come through, they wanted to rid the landscape of all the barriers and obstacles to this new livelihood. Well, the gray wolf and the Nez Perce were both the obstacles. And both of us were dispossessed of our ancestral homeland. But the reflection of the journey was to continue, but it was going to be a more optimistic journey. Because now the Nez Perce, as the sole leader in wolf reintroduction in the state of Idaho, getting that recognition, both of us, the Nez Perce and the wolves, were going to regain our rightful place, not just physically, but politically, socially, and spiritually, back as occupants on the lands upon which we were once removed. So in December, well, you can see our homeland, which covers most of central Idaho. So in December of 1995, the first 15 gray wolves were relocated from the Canadian Rockies onto Idaho. The Canadian wolves were from a similar environmental landscape and condition, which was felt to make their acclimation easier. And they were followed by 20 more wolves in 1996. And as I learned, wolf reintroduction is a blend of science, technology, but also political skills and respect for the economic and social fears that it generates. And so we became determined as a tribe not to manage the program in isolation of society, but still the program faced continued opposition, including Idaho's legislature that even demanded that wolf recovery be discontinued immediately and all wolves be removed by whatever means necessary. And the wolves are even denounced as being foreign wolves because they were relocated from Canada. So the wolves, we brought the wolves in over a 2-year period, and they were immediately radio collared when they were released. And as new pups were born, we were quick to respond, and we attempted to collar as many as the wolves as we could, as feasible. And tracking wolves was not just about the science, but also it enabled us to notify livestock and grazing interests on the movement of wolves if a wolf or a wolf pack was starting to encroach upon a grazing allotment. So it had important economic and social importance about trying to stay in front of the fears that the wolf recovery was generating. And I found it amazing that while livestock interests, outfitters and guides didn't like the program, they didn't support the reintroduction, but they showed us respect on the ground, which to me was a credit to our tribal biologists. But the abundance of habitat in Idaho just led to this immediate population boom, and it signaled, this pending success, but it also showed that there were challenges on the horizon. And I remember our lead biologist, I was on tribal council at the time, and our lead biologist comes into my office and he says, "Jamie, I have good news and I have bad news." He says, "Which one do you want first?" I said, "Oh, hell, Kurt, give me the good news." He said, "The good news is the wolves are recolonizing Idaho faster than we thought." Well, that's good news. I said, "All right, Kurt, what's the bad news?" "The bad news is the wolves are recolonizing Idaho faster than we thought." And what was happening was outstripping our capacity to continue to monitor and track wolves and to put collars on as packs were expanding and lone wolves were going off to start new packs. And it was going to jeopardize our ability to notify the livestock and the outfitters and the guides. And so, and I was fearful that if we did not have the resources to stay on top of this, then the tides of opposition would get stronger against us. And so I met with the Fish and Wildlife Service in D.C. pleading for additional resources, but they said, "You want more money, you got to go to the Congress. They're the appropriator, go get the money from them." All right. But I knew we couldn't make that request alone, so we needed local support. And one of the first people we approached was then Governor Phil Batt, a gracious gentleman. We weren't in the same political party, but he was just, his leadership was just phenomenal. And I remember sitting in the governor's office, and telling him, what we're up against, and he responded to me, he goes, Jamie, I never liked those goddamn things, but as long as they're here in Idaho, let's do a good job of tracking them, shall we? And he agreed. He wrote us a letter of support and sent it off to D.C. But the other thing I sensed in his voice and in his words was kind of the shifting acceptance of wolves in Idaho. So next we turn to our then senator, who was Dirk Kempthorne, and the senator was on the Appropriations Committee, but he didn't appropriate more money for this effort. He just robbed what Fish and Wildlife Service had already and directed they share it with us. And so we got our money. And then with wolves here to stay, Idaho's legislature finally conceded and adopted their own wolf management plan in 2002. And this now enabled Idaho Fish and Game to partner with the tribe on wolf recovery. And in 2005, we did an MOA with the state as partners in this recovery effort. But this delisting thing just became a roller coaster. It certainly did. The Fish and Wildlife Service tried to remove wolves from the Endangered Species Act, but it was appealed, and the federal court, and we were going back and forth, and it was exhausting. And I sensed the goodwill that we had created with the outfitters and guide was being tested because somebody else was winning in court. Somebody else was using the law to prevent us from delisting. And in 2011, after this exhausting litigation and tension, the Endangered Species Act was dealt this harsh blow because in a defense spending bill, Congress ordered the Interior Department to reissue the 2009 rule without regard to the Endangered Species Act. Recovery was legislated. Worrisome, a troubling precedent when Congress will step in and doesn't rely on the science, but uses legislation to delist a species. And perhaps to some combatants, the jury is still out on whether wolf recovery in Idaho succeeded, but I want you to keep in mind that ESA is merely a human law with a limited role in the rebound of the abundance of the wolves in Idaho. The major player in recovery was not even the Nez Perce tribe. So you set aside that human law for a moment because the credit for these wolf populations is due to natural law. It's natural law that enabled the wolves to thrive. Natural law is always wiser and smarter than human law. And maybe conservationists don't always measure success the same way that nature intends to, or the way that an Indian tribe would want to measure success. And in my opinion, regardless of the litigation, it was a success. And the numbers alone, look at the map here, the numbers alone signify success. 20 years after our first release, the progress report documented 104 packs in the state of Idaho, up 12 packs from the year before. Of the 43 packs that were sampled, 26 met the breeding pair criteria, and that's 16 packs above the delisting criteria. And it was the Nez Perce who were on the front lines weighing heavily on this with our science, with our technology, but also we worked the politics. We bled, we got bruised, we sweated hard, and we were also sensitive to our neighbors. It was the tribal blisters that got in there and fought some of the hard battles. So for me, I'll be honest with you, I was frustrated that somebody else was calling the shots in the courtroom, and drawing this recovery effort long and out for so long that finally Congress had to take these matters into their own hands. And that's just my opinion. So the wolves are here to stay, and that's a success story. And so the mirror does continue. The success of wolf recovery and the success of the Nez Perce go hand in hand. It was about self-determination and regaining our rightful place. Sometimes when I'm out speaking, I get asked to speak about how tribes shut things down. How we use our treaty rights or our sovereignty to stop a mining project or the development of fossil fuels. And I don't like talking about that kind of stuff because really, it's not in my nature. I had spent so much time, working on collaboration and negotiations of solutions. It's not what I want to talk about. And besides, I like to brag about the things that we build. So let me brag about this one here quickly. Of all the strategies you have going out there trying to rebuild and protect the natural world, this is my favorite strategy, if you're fortunate to come across it. And this is the strategy I call take hostages. Common cropina was spreading across the reservation area, and the Department of Agriculture, Federal Department of Agriculture was working with a consultant to develop an environmental assessment to control common cropina. And they had recommended the broadcast application of herbicides. And so, as a tribe, back then I was still running the tribe's natural resource program, and, we said we had legitimate concerns because as you broadcast this pesticide, going to spray tribal and non-tribal lands, but these lands are the ones that harbor our traditional foods and medicines. And so in our comments to the Ag Department on their proposal, we expressed the concern that the pesticides would present an unacceptable exposure risk to our tribal members who gather and consume these foods and medicines. But let me tell you, here's the federal government's response to our concerns. And it says, exposure is possible during spray operations to workers and the public if areas are not closed to use. Unless areas are posted, the public may be exposed on a repeated basis to residues on plants and materials gathered in a treatment area. That legitimizes the risk of exposure, doesn't it? Okay, now let me read to you the last sentence. However, public use would decrease because each treatment should result in fewer plants surviving that are commonly collected. All right, let's do the math together. Here's the rationale. If the government repeatedly applies the pesticides, they would successfully destroy the foods and medicines we gather. If the plants and foods and medicines are destroyed, then there's nothing out there to collect. If there's nothing to collect, then the humans wouldn't be out there collecting them, and thus we are protected from harm. Yeah, that was a hostage situation. And the federal government was embarrassed. The contractor, I think they fired him. Even the state of Idaho, who was a partner on this project, was equally embarrassed that this would be the answer, to eradicating. You got to eradicate a noxious weed by eradicating traditional foods and medicine and the people who collect them. And what the state did, they felt so guilty that they gave us a little grant, a little tiny grant. And they said, gosh, Nez Perce, why don't you go out and look at alternatives to pesticide application? And from that little grant, today has merged the Nez Perce Tribe's Biocontrol Station, where we're working within the Pacific Northwest, helping landowners, public, private, federal, whoever, try to find alternatives to using pesticides to control their noxious weeds. And yeah, I think it's a big victory. So we took a hostage and we were able to change the conversation and actually gave us time to come up with new options, where we don't have to rely on artificial means. It's one of my favorite stories. I always love that quote. It just burns me just to remember, to read that over and over again. All right, let's begin to wrap this up. You guys have been here a long time. Mary Wood also spoke about, in some of her legal writings, she talked about the conflict that began to grow when we went from abundance to the politics of scarcity. How in this nation's youth, man was really squaring off with nature, but as resources began to dwindle, man began squaring off with man, and the politics of scarcity began to take over. And I think about the icons, the icons of abundance and freedom and wildness, were things like wolves and salmon and bison. But today they're symbolic of the conflicts that underscore the weakening balance between nature and civilization. And I always think that nature is wiser beyond our imaginations, and leaps and bounds ahead of us. And, while we try to be the masters, we're not equals. And we'll always see these scientific disputes over our understanding of the natural world. It's just not the advocacy scientists that get into the fray, but, you see science being debated in peer-reviewed views and congressional oversight hearings, public scrutiny, including experts at coffee shops and on editorial pages, But I always think, the best available science is, when we admitted it, the best available science is that tough love science that shows us how the natural world really works. We can never fully mimic nature. We cannot repeat her handiwork. We can never take her place. But as we listen and learn and observe, we can do a better job of following her lead. Yesterday I was talking with some folks, and we're talking about the despair that might be out there because of the condition of the U.S. political institutions, this gridlock, the wide divisions in opinions and in values. But believe me, tribes have been through this wintertime many, many times before. And I see nothing to despair about, because it is a time to learn, and there's always a time to act. I learned in the state of Idaho, being a minority among minorities, there's a lot of lessons. In the rugged landscape of Nez Perce country, where it overlaps with Idaho, the sense of individuality is treasured, but the landscape that inspires that individuality will never survive if we remain nameless and faceless and anonymous. Life, I learned, is difficult in Idaho if you're a salmon. You got a lot of dams to go through. So life is difficult as a salmon, and life is difficult as an Indian, and really tough as an environmentalist. But life is hardest if you're a salmon-eating Indian environmental Democrat like me. But that's where I learned that the best political relationships are the human relationships, and never burn a bridge over a single issue, because there will come the day when we'll find hope in one another. Not long ago, I used to make time for reflection in the mountains or down by the river, but today I do that with my grandkids in my arms, the sight of their tears and the sound of their joys, because now the future has a face, and it makes me wonder if the strength in my heart and the depth of my wisdom will make this world a better place for them, or are we destined to plunder their inheritance? And it began with my oldest granddaughter, Tatum. And without words, as a baby, when I'd hold her in my arms, I could hear her speaking on behalf of the children of her generation when she would whisper to me, "Grandpa, don't disappoint us." As we labor to save the salmon, save wolves and our roots and berries, we labor to save ourselves. And the road ahead is not going to be easy. We'll be addressing expanding populations with increased demands for natural resources. We'll need to sway others to respond to evolving climate patterns around the world and its impact to the natural cycles. And we must be ready to negotiate our way through gridlock to make timely decisions. One of my favorite authors is Wallace Stegner, and I imagine some of you are familiar with his work. And he referred to the West as a native land of hope. And I draw that hope from my connection to the land, Nez Perce country, because it has a long memory that reminds us of places. It holds the symbols and reflections of our victories and sacrifices. It's the birthplace of our legends that are told and continually told. And the land also collects the evidence of our existence. And just as the earth cares for the remains of our ancestors, our bodies too will someday return to the care of the earth, our mother. And I try to make it home every year for Memorial Day reunion, for a reunion at Rapid River. And Rapid River is a tributary of the Salmon River, which they nicknamed the River of No Return. Well, as Rapid River twists and churns through the springtime, the Chinook salmon return to the healing waters of their birth. And right before the dawn, under the morning star, with that transition from night to light, I wade out waist deep with my dip net extended. I'm reunited with the chill of the river. For when the salmon make their way home, so do I. And let's try to seek the truth from salmon. They offer inspiration about life and about death. Painstakingly, as this constitutional obligation, the salmon exerting this innate passion, doing their best to overcome barriers that are made of concrete or political, they make their way back to their rivers to renew life. And even in death, a salmon's sacred duty is far from over. In death, with their own aging bodies, they nourish life in a river meant to give life, making their existence timeless, keeping hope alive in this native land of hope. And I'm a grandfather now, and I love this land more than ever before. And the truth is, I believe, is you love this land. You love your homelands too. And truth be told, long after I'm gone, long after we're gone, our actions will be used to judge the depth and the conviction of that love. And someday my grandchildren will have grandchildren of their own. And they'll be students of our history. They'll be standing at a looking back place. And I wonder, what will they see? What will they learn? Will they learn about how we became qualified in our time to make a difference? Or will they learn about how we were divisive and failed to respond to the challenges in our communities. Well, for me, with life, in 60 plus years, life still holds mysteries for me. So I don't know when my trail's going to end or where it's going to lead next. But I'm not afraid as I used to be. And I think I've got some valuable lessons. I've heard that for some, wisdom comes with age. Wisdom comes with age. And for others, age just shows up by itself. But some of us, we can't do it all in our lifetime, but we're going to try. But with age, I've come to understand when the best time of my life it will be. It is yet to come. If we make a difference, a truly lasting difference, like planting a tree, protecting a river's wildness, or responding with our neighbor to take on a challenge, then the best time of our lives will be lived long after we are gone. This is a lesson I hope my grandchildren will learn. And when they are old enough to understand, there is another lesson that I will teach them. And someday I hope they share this lesson with their grandchildren and perhaps even with yours. They will teach them that, according to my grandfather, there was a time. Thank you.